Welcome to Crime Era Channel, where every crime tells a story. The darkest secrets of crime are uncovered, and the hidden truths of criminal underworlds come to light. In the summer heat of 1967, Los Angeles pulsed with color, rebellion, and noise. The summer of love promised freedom, a world unchained from rules, war, and conformity. But beneath the haze of incense and LSD, a darker spirit was rising. And at its center was a man who wanted to be seen as a savior. Charles Manson arrived in California with a guitar, a dream, and a deep understanding of broken people. He was small, unassuming, yet possessed an energy that drew attention. To some, he was magnetic, a drifter who spoke of peace and cosmic truth. To others, he was manipulative, a man who could read weakness the way a pickpocket reads pockets. Born in 1934 to a teenage mother who drifted through crime and neglect, Manson's childhood was a revolving door of institutions. He learned early that charm was survival, and that belief, real or faked, could bend others to his will. By his 30s, he had spent half his life behind bars, but prison didn't harden him, it trained him. He studied the psychology of influence, Scientology, Dale Carnegie's How to Win Friends and Influence People, even the Bible. He wasn't learning faith, he was learning control. When he was released in 1967, Manson found a generation hungry for meaning. The youth were disillusioned with authority, chasing enlightenment in gurus, music, and drugs. Manson saw not chaos, but opportunity. He became a mirror for their confusion, reflecting back what they longed to hear, that they were special, chosen, part of something cosmic. He gathered his first followers in San Francisco, mostly young women running from broken homes and searching for belonging. He offered them love without judgment, a family without conditions. His words were intoxicating. No one owns you but the universe. But slowly, freedom became submission. His affection was rationed, his approval a reward. Each member learned that to please Charlie was to find peace. Manson used music as his gospel. He spoke of harmony, of vibrations, of oneness with nature. But beneath the melodies, he planted seeds of paranoia, that the world was ending, that society was built on lies, that only they could see the truth. It was manipulation wrapped in mysticism. They followed him to the desert, to the abandoned Spahn Ranch. There, surrounded by dust and isolation, his philosophy deepened. He preached that identity was an illusion, that ego was the enemy, that he alone could strip them of it. To the lost, it sounded like liberation. In truth, it was control disguised as enlightenment. By the firelight, he spoke in circles, the kind that never ended but always returned to him. He told them to unlearn morality, to live beyond guilt, beyond fear. He gave them new names, new roles, a new world in which he was both Father and God. And they obeyed, because Manson never shouted. He whispered. He made them believe they were awakening themselves. The family, as they called themselves, grew. Dozens of young men and women gave up everything to live under his rule. They scavenged, stole, and sang songs about love. But behind the music lay a cult built on psychological obedience. Manson didn't demand power. He made his followers offer it willingly. That was his genius and his curse. He began to dream of fame, convinced he would be discovered as a musician. Through a chance connection, he met record producer Terry Melcher, who was renting a house from actress Sharon Tate. Manson believed the world was about to hear his message, not of murder, but of revelation. But when Melcher rejected him, humiliation festered into rage. His teachings turned apocalyptic. He began speaking of Helter Skelter, a prophecy drawn from the Beatles' music and his twisted interpretation of Revelation. It was a coming war, he claimed, between races and classes, a war only his followers could survive. To outsiders, it was madness. To his followers, it was scripture. What began as peace had become prophecy. And in that shift lay the transformation of Charles Manson, from drifter to prophet, from dreamer to destroyer. His eyes, once filled with the light of self-belief, now burned with the certainty of destiny. The man who once spoke of love was preparing his family for a holy war. And they would follow him into it, not because they had to, but because he had convinced them that destruction was salvation. By the late 1960s, the Manson family had become more than a group. It was a world. On the dusty backlots of Spahn Ranch, they existed outside of time, untethered from the rules of the world they had abandoned. The young people who followed Charles Manson were not monsters when they arrived. They were seekers, believers, dreamers who wanted to escape the emptiness of modern life. What they found instead was a mirror reflecting their own hunger for purpose and a man who knew exactly how to feed it. The family's daily rhythm was carefully designed to dissolve individuality. They woke together, ate together, worked together. There were no clocks, no plans, no structure beyond Manson's moods. He called this freedom, but it was the opposite. By removing all external markers of time and choice, he made his followers dependent on him for every decision, every interpretation of meaning. Their lives became an extension of his will. To new arrivals, Manson was a paradox, part rock star, part preacher, part mystic. He spoke in riddles about ego, the universe, and the illusion of control. There's no such thing as right or wrong, he told them, only love and fear. He would stare into their eyes until they looked away, forcing them to confront the parts of themselves they had been running from. Many broke down in tears, mistaking the discomfort for spiritual awakening. What they didn't realize was that this was the first step in dismantling their identity. He encouraged his followers to shed their old names, their clothes, their pasts. They were reborn, free of history. But in losing themselves, they became blank pages, ready for Manson to write upon. He would alternate between affection and cruelty, praise and punishment, testing their loyalty. If someone defied him, the group would turn cold, united in silent disapproval. Social isolation became a weapon sharper than violence. Women made up the majority of the family. Manson told them they were the spiritual heart of the group, divine vessels of energy. In reality, they were tools for his control. He convinced them that sex was sacred only when shared under his direction, that jealousy was a sign of ego, and that surrender was the highest form of love. Some came to believe that giving themselves to him physically was a path to enlightenment. Others simply feared being cast out. But Manson's manipulation wasn't fueled by lust, it was about dominance. Every act of submission reinforced his godlike role. He told them he could see into their souls, that he could read their fears and speak their thoughts before they did. When someone doubted him, he'd predict an event or recite something they'd said years earlier, using fragments of past conversations to prove his omniscience. It wasn't magic, it was psychological precision. He fed them drugs, LSD, marijuana, anything to dissolve the barrier between thought and suggestion. During acid trips, he'd lead meditations, guiding them into visions where he appeared as Christ, or sometimes the devil. It's all the same thing, he'd whisper, light and dark, me and you. Under the influence, they believed him completely. Each trip blurred the boundaries of self until their inner voices became indistinguishable from his. Life at Spahn Ranch was a paradox of peace and tension. Days were filled with music, laughter, and freedom, but beneath the surface simmered paranoia and control. Manson began speaking more frequently about the outside world, how it was poisoned by greed and violence. He told his followers they were chosen to survive what was coming, a great cleansing, a revolution that would destroy society. And when it was over, they would emerge as the new family of man. The group's devotion deepened. They scavenged abandoned properties, practiced survivalism, and awaited signs of the coming war. Manson's worldview fused religion, music, and apocalyptic prophecy into one grand narrative, where he stood at the center. To him, the family wasn't just a group, it was the seed of a new civilization. Each member believed they were part of something sacred. Susan Atkins, Patricia Krenwinkel, Leslie Van Houten, young women barely in their 20s, saw Manson as a prophet who had freed them from the hypocrisy of the world. When he smiled, they felt chosen. When he frowned, they felt damned. Their identities melted into a collective we, bound by his will. As the family grew, so did Manson's ambition. He dreamed of fame, of spreading his message through music. When he failed to secure a record deal, his paranoia deepened. The world that had once ignored him would now have to listen. He began preparing his followers for a revelation, one that would shake the world awake. And somewhere between love and fear, devotion turned into danger. As the sun set behind the hills of Spahn Ranch, the desert turned gold and red. and Manson's voice would rise above the crackle of the fire. To the family, these gatherings were sacred sermons, moments where their teacher peeled back the layers of reality and revealed the truth behind the illusion. But beneath the spiritual poetry, Manson was crafting a gospel built not on faith, but on fear. He told them the world was on the brink of destruction. The cities, he said, were diseased, filled with hatred, corruption, and blindness. "You see them out there," he would whisper, "lost in their lies, chasing money and power. They're killing the earth. But we're the chosen ones. We're the light in the darkness." He didn't preach the apocalypse as a warning. He promised it as salvation. The old world would burn so that his could rise. To the family, it sounded like prophecy. To Manson, it was psychology. Fear bonded his followers to him more tightly than love ever could. When he described the chaos to come, the fires, the blood, the fall of governments, his voice carried both terror and comfort. The message was clear: the world would end, but only those who followed him would be reborn. He began to call the coming war Helter Skelter, borrowing the name from a Beatles song. He claimed the lyrics contained hidden messages, that the band was speaking directly to him, predicting a race war that would tear America apart. "The black man will rise," he said, "but he won't know what to do. He'll need a leader. That leader is me." His followers didn't laugh, they believed. Manson's gospel was a strange cocktail of racial paranoia, mysticism, and ego, a story so wild it could only be believed by those who had abandoned reality. The teachings grew darker. He told the family that death was an illusion, that life and death were one continuous cycle. If you kill, he'd say, you're only setting the spirit free. Under the influence of drugs, his words took on divine weight. He spoke like a prophet, his eyes wide, his smile serene. The desert wind carried his voice across the empty ranch, a lullaby for the lost. In these moments, even the doubters felt the pull. Manson knew how to make fear feel like enlightenment. He painted a world so chaotic that only submission offered safety. The family didn't see themselves as victims, they saw themselves as survivors preparing for the storm. They stockpiled supplies, practiced drills, and awaited the signal that the revolution had begun. But fear is a double-edged sword. Once planted, it spreads beyond control. Some members began to see omens everywhere: strange lights in the sky, whispers in the wind, newspaper headlines confirming Manson's predictions. Each sign strengthened their faith. Their fear became proof that he was right. At night, Manson would sit apart, staring into the flames. He spoke less now, his silence more powerful than any sermon. When he did speak, it was with the calm certainty of a man who believed his own myth. "The world belongs to those who can take it," he said, "and when the cities burn, we'll walk through the ashes like kings." He started sending small groups out to test the world, to see how far they would go in service of the cause. Petty thefts, break-ins, small crimes justified as preparations. Each act eroded their moral boundaries a little more. Guilt was replaced by righteousness and fear of disobedience. Defying Manson meant exile, and exile meant death. To be cast out of the family was to lose meaning, identity, existence itself. By now, the family no longer needed Manson to speak. His ideology lived inside them. When he wasn't present, they repeated his phrases, his rhythms, his interpretations of the world. His voice had become theirs. Fear had done its work. It had erased the line between leader and follower. The ranch itself became a living metaphor for their condition. Once a movie set, it was now a decaying stage where the script of Manson's apocalypse played out. Horses wandered through abandoned saloons, the wind howled through empty barns, and the family waited, certain that the first explosions of Helter Skelter were just beyond the horizon. And when fear becomes faith, obedience is inevitable. The gospel was complete. Manson had built a church without walls, with terror as its scripture, and himself as its God. By 1969, the family's world had become a sealed chamber of paranoia and devotion. Spahn Ranch was more than a refuge. It was a theater of prophecy, where every gust of desert wind seemed to carry a message from the divine. The nights were long, the acid trips longer, and Manson's sermons no longer felt like ideas. They were commandments. His followers didn't just listen, they believed. Helter Skelter had evolved from a metaphor into a mission. Manson's interpretation of the Beatles' White Album was the foundation of his gospel. To outsiders, the lyrics were nonsense. To the family, they were secret instructions. Songs like Revolution 9 and Blackbird weren't music, they were messages from heaven. They're telling us to rise, Manson explained, to start the fire that brings the new world. He claimed the Beatles were angels, that they too awaited his signal to ignite the revolution. The family hung on every word. When they listened to the records around the fire, the songs seemed alive, twisting, echoing his prophecies. The line between hallucination and revelation vanished. The prophecy was simple and terrifying. An imminent race war would engulf America. The black population would rise up against the white establishment, slaughtering the rich and powerful. Cities would burn. But, Manson said, Black America would not know how to govern itself. In the chaos, the family would emerge from their desert hideout to assume leadership of the survivors. "We will be kings," he told them. "We will inherit the earth." But the world wasn't moving fast enough for him. Each passing day without revolution fed his frustration. He started to believe it was his duty to spark the fire himself, to force the prophecy into motion. "If the world won't end on its own," he told them, "we'll make it." Underneath his spiritual language was the mind of a strategist. He began assigning roles. Some members were to collect weapons, others to scout potential targets. Manson's once abstract teachings hardened into operational plans. The family, high on LSD and blind faith, didn't see the shift from ideology to violence. They felt they were obeying destiny. Inside the ranch, fear and excitement fused into fanaticism. Susan Atkins and Patricia Krenwinkel whispered about signs in the sky. Tex Watson, Manson's most trusted enforcer, became the voice of action, the extension of Manson's will. Every glance from the leader felt like an order, every silence an approval. Manson would sit by the campfire, guitar in hand, strumming softly as he spoke of death and rebirth. "When the blood runs," he said, "the world will open its eyes." He told them that killing wasn't murder, it was cleansing. That death was merely a doorway to transformation. "It's not the end," he smiled, "it's the beginning of the music." Those words became scripture. The family began rehearsing apocalyptic scenarios like rituals, chanting, meditating, preparing their minds for the moment when Helter Skelter would truly begin. To them, it wasn't violence, it was prophecy made flesh. But there were cracks. Some followers still harbored doubts, though none dared voice them. Paul Watkins, one of the few who later escaped the family, remembered the atmosphere as suffocating. "You couldn't think," he said. "You couldn't breathe without Charlie being part of it. Every thought you had was his." Manson's paranoia intensified. He became convinced the government, the police, even rival gangs were plotting against him. Every stranger was an agent, every sound a signal. His need for control grew desperate. He began isolating members who questioned him, breaking their spirits with psychological games, denying food, affection, or attention until they submitted completely. The family's perception of morality dissolved entirely. They believed they were chosen instruments of a cosmic plan, and that morality itself was a lie, invented by a corrupt world. "We're beyond good and evil," Manson said one night. "We're pure creation now, and creation needs destruction." That was the night everything changed. Manson announced that Helter Skelter would begin soon. The family's role, he said, was to deliver the first strike, to show the world that chaos had arrived. "When they see what we do," he whispered, "they'll know the truth." In the silence that followed, the desert felt like it was holding its breath. The family's faces glowed in the firelight, young, lost, devoted. They weren't murderers yet, but in their minds, they were already soldiers of destiny. The prophecy had become a plan, and Manson had convinced them that blood was the key to paradise. August 8, 1969. The sun fell behind the Los Angeles hills, and darkness swallowed the city that believed it was untouchable. Up at Spahn Ranch, Manson's disciples gathered around him like shadows drawn to a flame. The air was heavy, charged with something that felt both sacred and wrong. That night, Manson whispered the words that would burn their names into history. "Now is the time," he said. "Helter Skelter begins." He turned to Tex Watson, calm, obedient, his eyes glazed with devotion. "You know what to do," Manson told him. "Leave something witchy." Tex nodded. Behind him stood three women, Susan Atkins, Patricia Krenwinkel, and Linda Kasabian. Barefoot, dressed in black, they climbed into a borrowed car and disappeared into the Los Angeles night. None of them knew their destination would become one of the most infamous addresses in America, 10050 Cielo Drive. Inside that house, actress Sharon Tate, 8.5 months pregnant, entertained friends. The night was ordinary, filled with laughter, music, and conversation. Outside, the Manson family moved silently through the darkness, armed with knives, a revolver, and orders written in blood. When they reached the gate, Tex climbed the fence and cut the telephone line. Linda stayed by the car, shaken. The others followed Tex up the driveway, their minds replaying Manson's voice. No guilt, no fear, death is not real. The first man they encountered was 18-year-old Stephen Parent, leaving after visiting the caretaker. Tex stopped him, gun raised. Parent's hands trembled. Before he could speak, Tex fired 4 times. The sound echoed through the canyon. Helter Skelter had begun. Inside, the family broke through the front door. Chaos erupted. Jay Sebring, a Hollywood hairstylist, tried to protect Sharon Tate. Abigail Folger and Wojciech Frykowski ran, screamed, fought for their lives. But to the family, this wasn't murder, it was ritual. Every scream was a note in Manson's symphony of destruction. Tex's commands cut through the panic. "I am the devil, and I'm here to do the devil's business." The phrase wasn't his own, it was Charlie's echo. The killings were brutal, frenzied, senseless. Each blow was meant to erase humanity, to prove loyalty through horror. When it was over, the silence was unbearable. The family stood among the bodies, their breaths ragged, their hands slick with blood. Manson's prophecy demanded a message, a sign, to mark the dawn of Helter Skelter. Susan Atkins dipped a towel in Sharon Tate's blood and scrawled a single word on the door: pig. Back at Spahn Ranch, the killers returned before sunrise. They were shaken but euphoric, expecting Manson's approval. When he saw them, he smiled faintly, like a father proud of his children. "You did well," he said, "but this is just the beginning. The world will wake up now." The next morning, the media descended on Cielo Drive. Photographs of the crime scene stunned the nation. A pregnant actress slaughtered, her friends mutilated. Reporters called it a massacre without reason. What they didn't know was that reason had been replaced by revelation. For Manson, the killings weren't about revenge or fame, they were performance. The violence was symbolic, meant to trigger chaos, to make the prophecy real. When the police arrived, the scene was so grotesque it felt supernatural, as though something had taken control beyond human comprehension. But Manson wasn't finished. He believed one murder wasn't enough to ignite Helter Skelter. "They won't understand yet," he told his followers. "We have to show them again." And the family, terrified, obedient, lost, prepared for a second night of slaughter. Some, like Linda Kasabian, wanted to run. Others convinced themselves that what they were doing was divine work. Manson's spell was complete. Fear, guilt, and faith had fused into one emotion: submission. In the days that followed, Los Angeles turned paranoid. Hollywood stars hired bodyguards, locked their gates, and whispered of cults, Satanists, and mad prophets. The illusion of safety had been shattered. For the family, though, there was no turning back. Manson had promised transformation through destruction, and they had crossed the threshold. Their innocence, if it ever existed, was gone. That night at Cielo Drive wasn't just a crime scene. It was the end of the 1960s, the death of the dream of peace and love. A single act of madness had rewritten an era. And deep in the desert, Charles Manson smiled at the chaos he had created, certain that the world was finally listening.
The blood at Cielo Drive hadn't even dried before Manson decided it wasn't enough. He told his family that the message hadn't been heard, that the world still slept. They didn't get it, he said, pacing the dusty ground at Spahn Ranch. We have to show them again. We have to make them see. The next night, August 9th, 1969, the family prepared once more. Tex Watson, Patricia Krenwinkel, and Leslie Van Houten were chosen. Manson himself would join them this time, not to kill, but to guide. "We'll go to a house," he said, "any house. It doesn't matter who they are. Fate will choose." They drove through Los Angeles in the dark, searching for a sign. Manson wanted randomness, violence that felt cosmic, not personal. After several false starts, they pulled into Los Feliz, a quiet, middle-class neighborhood. Manson crept up to a house he chose at random, 3301 Waverly Drive. Inside slept Lino and Rosemary LaBianca, a grocery store owner and his wife. Ordinary people, strangers to their killers. Manson slipped through the door first, carrying a revolver. He woke Lino, calm but menacing. "We're not going to hurt you," he said softly. "We just want your money." Lino nodded, confused, still half asleep. Manson reassured him, then tied his hands with a leather thong. "Don't worry," he whispered. "You're not going to die." Then he left, handing control to Tex, Krenwinkel, and Van Houten. His job was done. Theirs was about to begin. Tex entered the bedroom where Rosemary slept. She woke to the sight of strangers, knives glinting in the dark. Her screams filled the house. From the living room came the sound of struggle, Lino gasping, the chair toppling, then silence. Tex called out to the others, "It's time." What followed was chaos. The murders were brutal, confused, frenzied. Lino was stabbed dozens of times. A carving fork was left jutting from his stomach, a knife in his throat. On the wall, the family left words scrawled in blood, "Death to pigs." In the kitchen, Krenwinkel wrote another phrase, "Helter Skelter," misspelled, desperate, prophetic. When they left, the house was silent. The family drove away, euphoric and dazed. They had crossed another line, one they could never return from. Back at Spahn Ranch, Manson listened as they recounted every detail. He nodded slowly, satisfied. "Now they'll understand," he said. "Now it begins." But beneath his calm was something darker, a realization that he had gone too far to ever turn back. Over the next few days, Los Angeles descended into hysteria. Newspapers screamed of ritual slangs and satanic cults. Police were baffled. The murders seemed unconnected, random, and incomprehensible. That was exactly what Manson wanted. Confusion was the first step toward revolution. Within the family, paranoia began to grow. Some members whispered that the end of the world was near, that the police were coming, that Manson had summoned something beyond human control. Others clung even tighter to him, convinced that only he could protect them from the chaos they'd unleashed. The ranch, once a place of music and freedom, had turned cold. Every sound of a helicopter made hearts race. Manson ordered everyone to pack and prepare to move deeper into the desert, to a place he called the bottomless pit, where they would hide until Helter Skelter consumed the world. But fear had begun to eat at his control. Tex and the girls started having nightmares, flashes of blood, screams, faces they couldn't forget. Manson told them it was just their old selves dying. "Don't fight it," he said. "This is rebirth." In the city, detectives pieced together clues. The word pig, the strange misspelling of Helter, the eerie similarities between the two crime scenes. Slowly, the web began to close. Still, at Spahn Ranch, Manson preached calm. "They'll never find us," he said. "We're invisible, we're spirits." But his eyes betrayed something new, fear. The prophet who had claimed to transcend the material world was starting to feel the weight of it closing in. When the family finally lay down to sleep that night, the desert wind howled through the empty set of an old Western film. The ghosts of their victims were everywhere, in the creak of the barns, in the whisper of the sand. Helter Skelter had begun, but it wasn't the world that was ending, it was them. The desert had gone silent. What was once the Manson family's sanctuary, filled with laughter, guitars, and acid-fueled sermons, had become a place of ghosts. The aftermath of the murders lingered like a curse. Spahn Ranch no longer pulsed with energy, it reeked of paranoia. Every rustle in the dry brush sounded like police. Every visitor was an informant in disguise. The family, once bound by devotion, was now bound by fear. Manson tried to hold on to his control. He spoke of destiny, of the cleansing still to come, of the world's blindness. "They don't know what we've done for them," he told his followers. "They don't understand yet, but they will." His voice still carried authority, but the spark had dulled. Even his truest believers sensed the shift. The man who once promised freedom now seemed trapped inside his own prophecy. Then came the raids. The police, investigating stolen vehicles, descended on Spahn Ranch in late August. Officers swarmed the property, rounding up Manson and his followers. The family sat in the dirt, silent, as the myth of their invincibility collapsed around them. For a brief moment, Manson smiled. "You can't arrest the truth," he said softly, as if to himself. But the spell was broken. The arrests didn't last. The police had no idea they were holding the architects of the Cielo Drive and La Bianca murders. Within days, many were released. Manson took this as proof of divine protection. "See," he told them, "even the law knows who's chosen." But behind the bravado, panic festered. The walls were closing in. To maintain control, Manson turned inward, deepening the doctrine. He declared himself both Christ and Satan, two sides of the same coin. "They crucified one," he said, "but this time I'll finish the job." The family listened, eyes hollow, their leader growing more erratic. His teachings became darker, his paranoia sharper. He spoke of betrayal, of traitors within. And when someone questioned him, the punishment was isolation or violence. The family fractured under the weight of fear. Some fled into the desert, others drifted toward neighboring communes. Those who stayed did so out of dependency, not faith. They had built their lives around him, their identities, their worth, their very sense of existence. To leave was to vanish. Then, one by one, the cracks became earthquakes. Whispers began to reach the police, from ex-members, from frightened outsiders, from those who could no longer live with the guilt. The connection between Spahn Ranch and the murders began to form, piece by bloody piece. Susan Atkins, jailed on unrelated charges, began to talk. At first, her story sounded like hallucinations, but the details matched the crime scenes. The words written in blood, the names, the twisted theology of Helter Skelter. Investigators listened in disbelief as she described the killings, her voice calm, detached, almost proud. "Charlie told us to do it," she said. "It was the beginning of the revolution." The police moved fast. In a series of raids, Manson and his remaining followers were taken into custody. This time, there was no escape. The dream of a desert utopia ended with flashing lights, barking dogs, and the clatter of handcuffs. Inside his cell, Manson was calm. "You can't imprison the soul," he told reporters later. "I didn't kill anyone, I just showed them who they were." But even as he denied his guilt, he reveled in the attention. For a man who had spent his life unseen, the spotlight was intoxicating. The newspapers made him a symbol of everything America feared: chaos, rebellion, the death of innocence. At Spahn Ranch, the few who remained waited for him to return. They still believed the end of the world was near, that their leader would rise again and lead them to safety. They sang his songs, carved X's into their foreheads, and prepared for his signal. But the signal never came. By the time autumn turned to winter, the family was broken, a shattered reflection of the man who had created it. Manson's promises of unity and transcendence had dissolved into paranoia and betrayal. The family wasn't a movement anymore. It was a memory and a warning. The fall wasn't sudden. It was slow, inevitable, and eerily quiet, like a candle burning down to its final ember.
The courtroom was a theater, and Charles Manson was its self-appointed director. Cameras flashed, pens scratched, and the world leaned in to watch the man who had turned peace-loving youth into killers. The Manson trial wasn't just a legal proceeding. It was a spectacle, a mirror held up to the darkest corners of the human psyche. When Manson entered the courtroom, his presence was electric. Barefoot, scruffy, and defiant, he carried himself not as a prisoner, but as a preacher. His followers, the women who had once danced at Spahn Ranch, now sat in the gallery, heads shaved, foreheads carved with the same X that marked Manson's own. They sang his songs outside the courthouse, chanting, "Charlie's our father, Charlie's our savior." The world watched in disbelief. Who was this man who inspired such devotion? How had ordinary young people transformed into zealots, unflinching in their loyalty even after the horror of Cielo Drive? Inside the courtroom, the prosecution painted Manson as a manipulator, a failed musician who had twisted spiritual ideals into weapons. Vincent Bugliosi, the lead prosecutor, spoke calmly but with conviction. These murders, he said, were not random acts of violence. They were the result of one man's delusion, a man who used words as bullets and people as his guns. Manson smirked through it all. He laughed, interrupted, glared at the jury, and sometimes spoke in riddles. "You're all in a game," he said once, smiling thinly, "and I'm the only one who knows the rules." His behavior was erratic yet theatrical, calculated to maintain the illusion of control. The evidence was damning: bloody clothing, fingerprints, stolen items, and the testimonies of former family members. But the true weapon of the prosecution was the ideology itself. Bugliosi laid out Manson's prophecy of Helter Skelter, his belief in a race war, his manipulation through drugs and fear. The courtroom fell silent as recordings and statements revealed how Manson's words had led to murder. When Susan Atkins, Leslie Van Houten, and Patricia Krenwinkel spoke, their devotion was chilling. They smiled, giggled, and declared their love for Manson. "We did it for him," Atkins said, her voice calm. "We did it for love." To the jury, it sounded like madness. To Manson, it was proof of his power. The trial became a battle not just of facts, but of myth. The defense claimed Manson was a scapegoat, a product of a society that had lost its way. "You made him," his attorney argued. "You made him by rejecting him, by building a world where the lost have no place." But Manson undermined even his own defense, turning the trial into performance art. He carved an X into his forehead to symbolize his rejection of the system. "I am nothing," he said. "I am nobody. I am what you made me." The media fed on every word. Headlines called him the devil, the messiah of murder, the monster of the 60s. The counterculture, once obsessed with peace and freedom, suddenly faced its dark reflection. The line between rebellion and destruction had blurred, and Manson stood at the center, a symbol of how easily charisma could become control. When the verdict came, it was unanimous: guilty. Manson and his followers were sentenced to death. As the decision was read, Manson leaped toward the judge, shouting, "You can't kill me, I'm already inside you all." The women screamed in unison, their voices echoing through the courtroom. It was chaos, fitting for a man who had built his kingdom on it. Outside, the public breathed a sigh of relief. Justice, they thought, had been served. But the truth was more complicated. Manson hadn't just committed murders, he had exposed something deeper: the fragility of the human mind when confronted with charisma, fear, and belonging. Years later, his death sentence was commuted to life imprisonment after California temporarily abolished capital punishment. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The man who claimed to be immortal had, in a sense, been spared by fate. From behind bars, Manson continued to speak, to journalists, to followers, to anyone who would listen. His words were still cryptic, his influence still dangerous. "You can lock up a body," he said once, staring through the bars, "but you can't lock up an idea." The trial of a prophet had ended, but the myth of Charles Manson was only beginning to grow. Long after the courtroom lights dimmed and the headlines faded, the shadow of Charles Manson stretched across the decades. His name became synonymous with evil, yet his influence lingered, in culture, in psychology, in the uneasy corners of human fascination. Manson may have been locked behind bars, but his mythology lived freely, whispering through songs, films, and the quiet fear that charisma can kill. In prison, Manson became both a relic and a warning. He granted interviews, rambling in riddles and half-truths, smiling that same cryptic smile that had once enchanted the young and the lost. Reporters came seeking answers, redemption perhaps, but left with more questions.
"I didn't lead them," he would say. "They led themselves. I just showed them the way." The phrase chilled anyone who understood the power of suggestion. For psychologists, Manson was a case study in manipulation, a living textbook on coercive control. He wasn't physically imposing, nor particularly educated, but he possessed an instinctive grasp of human weakness. He could sense who was vulnerable, who was searching, who was ready to surrender. And when he spoke, he mirrored their fears and hopes until they believed he was their reflection, the voice inside their own souls. Outside the prison walls, the world couldn't look away. Books, documentaries, and songs kept his name alive. The Beatles' Helter Skelter, once a chaotic anthem of youth, now carried a dark echo. Filmmakers recreated his story, fascinated by the contrast between his small stature and his vast control. Musicians referenced him, artists painted him, true crime obsessed over him. Manson became both symbol and commodity, the nightmare people couldn't stop buying. Yet beneath the spectacle lay a more uncomfortable truth. Manson was not an isolated anomaly. His story revealed something timeless about the human condition: our hunger for belonging, our willingness to trade autonomy for acceptance, and our tendency to mistake charisma for wisdom. The family's tragedy was not just about one man's madness. It was about how easily good intentions can be hijacked by those who understand the language of need. In the years that followed, other leaders emerged, some preaching salvation, others self-improvement, and echoes of Manson's methods could be felt in their circles. The manipulation of identity, the promise of enlightenment, the isolation from family and reality, all tools of control dressed as liberation. Manson had merely dramatized what others refined more subtly. For his followers, the decades brought a painful reckoning. Leslie Van Houten, Patricia Krenwinkel, and Susan Atkins grew older behind bars, their youthful zeal replaced by remorse and reflection. They spoke of how Manson had controlled their thoughts, how they'd lost themselves in his voice. "He took everything," one of them said years later, "even the part of me that knew it was wrong." Their words became a tragic chorus, a warning for future generations about the cost of surrendering one's mind. Society, too, struggled with what Manson had represented. He was not a serial killer in the traditional sense. He had not wielded the knife. His weapon was ideology. He'd killed with suggestion, with belief. It forced the world to confront a deeper fear, that evil doesn't always wear a mask or hold a gun. Sometimes it speaks softly, promising love, truth, or freedom. By the 1990s and 2000s, Manson's image had mutated into pop culture absurdity. A face printed on t-shirts, a subject of late-night jokes, a macabre icon of rebellion. But for those who remembered 1969, the laughter rang hollow. Behind the caricature was the reality of blood, loss, and lives that never returned. In interviews near the end of his life, Manson's tone oscillated between rage and poetry. "You all think you're better than me," he once said, "but I'm just the mirror. You see me, you see yourselves." There was truth in his madness, a reflection of a culture that birthed him, used him, and never truly let him die. Even after his death in 2017, his ashes scattered quietly in California. The fascination persisted. The Manson case still filled documentaries, podcasts, and endless online discussions. What drew people wasn't just horror, it was curiosity. How could one man with no weapons or armies command such devotion? The answer was never comfortable, because he understood what people feared most and offered them a way to belong in spite of it. The shadow of Manson's influence isn't measured in followers anymore. It's measured in awareness of how manipulation works, of how control hides behind charm, and how the boundaries between faith and fear can dissolve in the hands of someone who knows how to pull the strings.
Time has a way of softening faces, but not memories. The name Charles Manson still drifts through documentaries, college lectures, and late-night conversations like a ghost that refuses to fade. His story has become more than a cautionary tale. It's a mirror held up to power, persuasion, and the human hunger to believe in something, even when it leads to ruin. In the years after Manson's death, the fascination only deepened. New generations, born decades after the blood of Cielo Drive dried, discovered his story through streaming platforms and true crime retrospectives.
They watched grainy footage of his wild eyes, his cryptic words, and the calm devotion of the women who called him father. And many asked the same chilling question: could this happen again? The answer, history suggests, is yes, because the core of Manson's power wasn't unique, it was human. Every era produces its own prophets of persuasion, men and women who sense the cracks in society and slip through them. They find the lonely, the idealistic, the searching, and promise them meaning. Manson didn't invent manipulation, he simply turned it into theater. The echoes of his control can be felt in modern cults, self-help empires, and online movements that thrive on devotion and fear. The tools have changed. No more communes in the desert, no handwritten prophecies, but the structure remains. A charismatic figure, a narrative of crisis, a promise of enlightenment, and a gradual surrender of autonomy. Manson's story endures not because it was extraordinary, but because it was ordinary in the most terrifying way. For decades, former family members have tried to rebuild their lives. Some found faith, others sought therapy, and a few still wrestle with the shadow of the man who shaped their youth. When asked what kept them there, most answered the same way: he made me feel seen. It was the simplest magic, recognition, and it was enough to destroy them. Experts who study cult psychology often return to Manson's case as a blueprint of manipulation. It demonstrates how belief can override reason, how language can dismantle identity, and how love can be weaponized. What's more haunting than the murders themselves is the realization that Manson didn't coerce through violence, he seduced through belonging. In the modern world, where millions seek identity in digital spaces, those lessons feel more relevant than ever. Charisma still holds power, narratives still shape belief, and control, when disguised as purpose, still finds its audience. Manson's shadow stretches into new mediums, from social media influencers who cultivate near-religious devotion to extremist groups that recruit with stories of truth and awakening. The platforms have evolved, but the psychology remains ancient. As decades turned into half a century, the house on Cielo Drive is demolished, the ranch crumbled into dust, and many of the faces in Manson's circle faded into obscurity. Yet the myth persisted because Manson had stopped being a man long before his death. He had become an idea, the embodiment of what happens when charisma meets chaos, when love becomes domination, and when faith surrenders to fear. The story of Charles Manson is, at its core, the story of human vulnerability. It's not about monsters hiding in the dark, it's about the darkness that hides inside the need to belong. When people speak of him now, they speak of manipulation, of cults, of horror. But behind every discussion is the quiet recognition that Manson didn't create the void, he filled it. In his final interview, years before his death, Manson spoke softly, his voice cracked with age. "I'm just a reflection of you all. You made me, and I showed you what you are." His words weren't entirely wrong. Every culture creates the figures it fears most, the prophets of its own contradictions. The echo of control he left behind still hums beneath the surface of modern life. It's in every leader who promises absolute truth, every movement that demands blind loyalty, every voice that says, "Follow me," without asking why. The real legacy of Charles Manson isn't the blood he spilled, but the warning he left, that the line between enlightenment and manipulation is thinner than we think, and that sometimes the most dangerous prisons are built not of bars, but of belief. Thank you for stopping by at Crime Era Channel. We hope you enjoyed your time here. Ensure you like and subscribe to our channel so you get notified each time we uncover another hidden crime story. Don't forget to share so your friends and family so they too can know the hidden truth.